this meeting started. Anybody talking, standing behind me, otherwise causing disruption? You're good. My name's Steve Train. I'm the governor's appointee from the state of Maine, and I'm the chairman of the Lobster Board, and we're going to start the Lobster Board meeting now. It's kind of nice to have the meeting this close in New Hampshire. It's easy for me to get here, and like most of the things in New Hampshire, it's led by two Mainers. Everybody got the agenda, I'm certain. Do we have any additions, deletions, or corrections on the agenda? If not, I'll consider the agenda is here. I'm sure everyone approves the agenda. Do we have any additions, deletions, corrections on the previous meeting's minutes? If not, I'll consider them both approved by consensus. So we'll move forward. Public comment. I don't have anybody on my list for public comment. Is there anybody in the back of the room that would like to comment on anything not on the agenda, which pretty much leaves it wide open? Seeing none, we're on to the next thing. Discuss reporting requirements for 2020. Caitlin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll go quickly through this, but for some context, Addendum 26 for lobster and 3 for Jonah crab require the collection of a few additional data elements in the commercial harvester reports that had not previously been required, and the original implementation date for those was January 1st, 2019, but that date was delayed to January 1st, 2020 to allow for those data elements to get added into the reporting platforms. Most of the elements have been added in at this point, but there are still 2 which are bolded on the screen here that have not been added in, and those are location reported via 10-minute square and the number of buoy lines. And additionally, there are a few data elements that are not reported consistently across the management unit, and a few data elements that have been recommended to be added for lobster and Jonah crab reports. So these are the 4 inconsistently reported data elements, and they include number of traps hauled, traps set, traps per trawl, and number of buoy lines. And in different areas, these are just reported in different formats. So the recommendation is that the data work group be tasked with determining a consistent method or format for reporting and collecting this information in the harvester reports. Reporting data on maximum depth, bait type, bait quantity, and buoy line diameter is not currently required for Addendum 26 or 3. However, the whale and bait-related work groups discussed these items and thought they would be helpful information to collect for their efforts. So it's recommended that these 4 data elements also get added to the commercial harvester reports and reporting platforms. So today, the recommended action for the board is to postpone the implementation of the requirement to collect location via 10-minute square and number of buoy lines until January 1st, 2021 in order to allow more time for these to get added to the reporting platforms. And that is all I've got.
Sherry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, number of buoy lines, I'm a little concerned with postponing that sort of information. As people well know, there is a critical data need for that particular data element, especially as we are moving into a new right whale versus lobster harvester scenarios, and we're all trying to come up with some sort of risk reduction. That's going to happen in 2020, some sort of risk reduction. After that, there needs to be some sort of way to show that risk reduction does not increase from that particular baseline. In order to determine that, you pretty much need to have the number of buoy lines that are out there. So I'm a little hesitant to postpone the implementation of the buoy lines.
Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I was curious, I also have some discomfort with the postponement, I was curious about the data recording aspect of this. Is it, so we could require something and there might be nowhere to put the data electronically, so I'm trying to get a little more information on that. Is it not ready for 2020? Because that would influence my vote on this.
Tony?
So for the 10-minute squares, the aspect for collecting that on e-trips is available now, or will be available for 2020, but in the safest computer system, it is not available, and it won't be available till about middle of the year once the safest redesign has been completed. For the number of buoy lines, that aspect could be available for the e-trips, if I'm correct, but also would need to be added to the computer version of SAFES for 2020.
Go ahead, Jason.
Thanks. So it's in e-trips. If a state has altered their paper logbook system, it could be there. But then so it's paper logbook is there. It's stored on paper, which isn't ideal, but it's there. It could be entered later. I don't think I understand. So if you put in data into the field in e-trips, where does it go?
So if you choose the 10-minute square, it's actually doing a sort of a lat-long tag, and that's what's going into our system. And the issue with the 10-minute square outside of the eTrips system, or specifically the eTrips mobile system, is that the eTrips online system does not have a similar 10-minute square. We would just have a lat-long, which could be translated into a 10-minute square, which is a possibility. For those partners or states that are not collecting a lat-long coordinate, there is no finalized existing grid for how they would name those 10-minute squares. Therefore, there's no ability for them. Electronically, it's easy. We just created a map, they pick one, and it's done. There would need to be maps that accompany the paper logbooks where people would have to have names for all of the 10-minute squares, and that hasn't been done. And additionally, those who were having this conversation were very concerned about the fact that any particular change in area is considered, any particular change in area or gear is how we are currently defining effort. And if you change the area definition from a statistical area to a 10-minute square, you're not just doing it for lobster, you're doing it for every fishery. And so every time you change 10-minute squares, you would have to start a new effort, and that would be across every fishery, including lobster. And we were concerned that that was a very large change to make without making sure everyone was aware of the impact of what that change would be.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to, in my mind, figure out how this is all going to play out, because the state of Maine has been now required to have 100% harvester reporting by 2024. That harvester reporting is going to include all of these things that we're postponing. We're in the process of starting to develop these tools. I am hesitant to have a work group start working on these things, not knowing how that's going to change the work that we're trying to do right now. Is something else going to come up that through this process that is going to potentially modify our ongoing efforts at DMR to come into compliance? We had talked about this, and it's all fundraising dependent on how we can or cannot come up with the overall cost of the program to implement. It's going to be one of the most requiring Maine to go to 100% harvest reporting is probably the most costly motion ever put in place as far as what the impact to the state is. And so I'm very concerned about how this particular action could impact the work that we're doing going forward. I want to make sure if we're going to do this, we're going to do it once, we're going to do it right.
Tony?
For the postponement of the 10-minute squares and the buoy lines, I think that that's pretty straightforward. It's just that there's not the ability to collect it on all platforms, and so therefore we didn't want to make it a requirement for fishermen for states that don't utilize just E-Trips mobile. There are also some states that had some concerns that they would not be able to fit it on their paper forms and wanted additional time to work through that. For the items that were recommended by the work group, we had a concern that some states or agencies were collecting that information or deriving it in different ways. And if you're wanting to use some of that information on an assessment level, then it's important that we're collecting it consistently to be able to utilize it at the assessment level consistently. So we wanted to work with the folks from the states that are doing the data collection to get that information in the most efficient and effective way in order to be able to translate that to the assessment process cleanly. And I believe we should be able to do that within a 6-month time period.
Anybody else? I do think we do also, if this does get delayed, we do have the control date that we put in on 4/19. We might not have all the data, but we have that date saying anything after that may be treated differently. So if we see a real escalation of effort before this happens, we do have that control date available to us. I don't know if it'll work, but we have it. Tony.
And just one other thing, just because we delay this, if a state has the ability to collect this information, we are not preventing them from doing that. And I recognize that it is very important to get the number of buoy lines for the whale information. And so if there's a way for a state to go ahead and collect that this year, then that's fantastic.
And now we're on to update on the resiliency of the Gulf of Maine. Sorry about that. Are there any objections to the discussion on the reporting requirements? Okay. Now on to the discussion on resiliency. Did you see one? Who is it?
Oh, Peter Burns.
Peter Burns, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to note I'm going to abstain on this because this pertains to state reporting requirements. Thank you.
Back to you, Caitlin.
Okay, thank you. I'll go over this quickly as well.
Craig Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also have a concern about extending this to 2021. Just the optics isn't good, and I wonder if there's a way to change that last portion so that it doesn't appear as though it's another whole year of putting it off. It may be that technologically, even if everybody gathers the information, it'll be sometime after January 1st, 2021. But the message, I think, that sends is not good. But I don't know how to exactly fix it to do what Tony was saying probably we will be able to do.
Tony?
I I understand the concern, Craig, and I don't know what else we can do technologically. We just don't have the ability to collect all of these data pieces on all platforms. Therefore, it would be very difficult for us to make it a requirement for fishermen to collect that, or for states to collect that information from the fishermen if we can't make it available on all the platforms, unless we forced everybody to use e-trips. Or if you had it on your paper form, you could collect it. The state could collect it there. And we, in terms of compliance and consistency, we discussed having the requirement be made halfway through when it became available, when the safest redesign had been completed, but we were concerned about getting that information out to the fishery and getting compliance and having a consistency for the data collection for the entire fishing year. And so therefore, as a work group, we decided to make that recommendation to start in the next fishing year when all the data elements would be available on all the platforms.
Dan McKernan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is a motion in order to delay these elements?
I was advised no, so I just need a consensus on accepting the report.
Well, before you do, what I've found in this process is there's us as a board, and we come up with certain mandates through our votes, and then the TC folks also have their desires and needs, and then it all falls on the data people to figure all this out. And what I've learned is that there was some unintended consequences of some of the requirements that even the TC had asked for, specifically trip length. What we discovered through internal conversations is that trip length was of great interest to the TC when they wanted to look at the offshore fishery or the fishery that's functionally offshore. But they didn't really care about trip length for an inshore lobsterman who's doing a day trip. Well, this is going to have an enormous amount of implications and burden for us as we have our paper reporting lobstermen who give us trip level reports to be giving us trip length data, which is actually not really of any importance to the TC. So if this is an ongoing initiative, and we're going to hear back from the data folks maybe at our February meeting about progress, I'd also like to see if trip length could be re-examined, because our data folks feel that may be an unnecessary parameter to be collecting, because our data collection systems is the same for everybody, whether you're digging clams, cohogs, dragging, or lobstering. If you're part of the state reporting system, it's one form, and we don't feel that trip length is worth it. So could I ask trip length to be examined as well?
It's not one of the elements that any of the states said that they had an issue collecting, so it was not brought up in the discussion that the data work group had, and trip length can be collected in two different ways. It either can be collected through start time and end time on the report, or total trip time, just, number of hours. So if it's an issue for your state, then we can bring it back up to the work group, but it was already a requirement. It's been a requirement all along since Addendum 10, I believe. So
But I'd still like to have it discussed by the data work group if I could.
We can do that. And it was my understanding that this board already agreed to the postponement through that. We just asked if anybody objected, so if we need to do that again because somebody's objecting, then we can, but I thought we just agreed to it, to postpone.
Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question that just came to me during this discussion.
Welcome to the webinar. You have entered as an attendee in listen-only mode.
Okay. It was said that not all platforms that fishermen use that will work now, but how many platforms would work now, and what percentage of the fishermen are using what percent of platforms, and if it's a substantial amount, wouldn't it make sense to go ahead and collect the data on the platforms that do work?
It varies by state, Richie. There are, in some states, they will be able to put it on their paper forms. In other states, they will not. It is available on eTrips Mobile, but there is not a large percentage of the fishery that is using eTrips Mobile at this time. And it is not available on Safest, which is where the larger percentage outside of state paper forms.
Okay, we've gone back to 4. We've had enough. I hope everyone's satisfied with the answers now. Pat, I guess not.
No, I haven't had enough. I'm having too much fun with this. Bait and the amount of bait. Can somebody please tell me how we're going to use that for management decisions? Why are we going to be pulling that type of information?
It came out of the bait work group for wanting to know the different types of bait that are being utilized in the fishery. When the herring bait quota dropped, we were trying to figure out what other types of bait are being used to be able to make sure that there aren't things going into the fishery that could be potentially dangerous to the environment or the species, and so therefore it was something that came out of that work group to ask for. As again, it's not a requirement, it was a suggestion, and it wouldn't be a requirement unless the board moved on that.
On to item number 5 again. Update on resiliency in the Gulf of Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a very brief presentation on Addendum 27 on Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank resiliency. For some background, in August 2017, the board got a report from the Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank subcommittee that was established to discuss future management of the stock given changing ocean conditions. The committee was concerned about the decreasing trends in Maine's larval settlement survey over recent years, worried that it could foreshadow declines in recruitment and landings for lobster, and the subcommittee, based on that, recommended initiating an addendum to increase the resiliency of the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank stock by considering uniform management measures across the stock. They felt this would be a proactive response to provide some additional biological buffer through the protection of spawning stock biomass across the LCMAs. So the board did take that recommendation and initiated draft addendum 27, but following the initiation of that addendum, as you know, Atlantic right whale issues became prioritized, so efforts on draft addendum 27 were stalled. The PDT did manage to draft a document, but it was never presented to this board. So currently, the focus of that draft document is on the standardization of management measures across the LCMAs in the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank stock, since there are currently some differences in management measures in those LCMAs that would allow some lobsters to be protected in one LCMA but harvested in another. So 5 issues are focused on in that addendum. Issue 1 is focused on V-notching. Issue 2 asks what the minimum gauge and vent sizes should be. Issue 3 asks about the maximum gauge size for the LCMAs in this stock. Issue 4 asks whether tags issued for trap tag losses should be issued before or after trap tag loss occurs, or trap loss occurs. And issue 5 asks if the regulatory changes that would result from this addendum should apply throughout LCMA 3 or just to the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank portion of LCMA 3. So today, the board should consider the current priority level of this addendum and whether work on it should be continued at this time, and if so, what the desired timeline would be for its completion. And in addition, it would be worthwhile to discuss whether the management measures being proposed in the draft addendum would result in the level of resiliency that this board is looking for. Standardizing management measures could add some protection for the stock, however, would not likely result in reduced harvest, so it might be valuable to discuss what levels of resiliency are needed for the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank stock and whether the proposed management measures would achieve those. And that's that's all I've got. Any questions?
Questions for Caitlin? Go ahead, Pat Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, and thanks for the update on the resiliency addendum. I fully supported delaying the development of the addendum at the time we were dealing with the right whale issue, and while the issues around regulatory environment of right whales is not finalized, we certainly are in a place where I think we need a PDT to be working on a resiliency addendum as a high priority. Just to update the board, as of the end of September, Maine lobster landings are down significantly, below 50 million pounds to date. And as a reminder, we landed 119 million pounds in 2018, so our landings are way off. Now, that doesn't mean the sky is falling. That means we certainly have a very big delay in the shed, but that is certainly not the entire reason why we are having significant declines in lobster landings. And as such, I think we need to be getting the assessment work done, finalizing the assessment, and then reinitiating efforts at the PDT level on this resiliency addendum so we can start taking actions on it. Thank you.
Tony?
Pat, I have a question based on what you just said. Do you feel that the PDT should be working now as the stock assessment team is finishing up the assessment, or do you want the PDT to wait until the assessment results come out? And then question two is, are you still looking for consistent management measures, or are we looking for something different that, as Caitlin said, may reduce harvest or make other changes to the fishery?
Go ahead, Pat.
Considering the people are going to be the same from an assessment standpoint to a PDT standpoint, I mean, I would like to start working on it now, but I don't want to delay the assessment. I think we need the assessment to be finalized, and possibly, it's always dangerous when I'm thinking and talking at the same time, but, maybe we need a small work group to start looking at the issues around what's currently in the addendum and if we need to add any additional items. I'm certainly not prepared to put anything on the table right now, but maybe a small work group that could be working through that between now and the winter meeting would be useful.
You happy with that, Tony? Okay, anybody else? Questions about resiliency, comments? Okay. Item number 6 is the progress update on the 2020 American Lobster Benchmark Stock Assessment. Oh, Jeff's giving that. I didn't see you over there.
Snuck up on you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the last time I've updated this board on the stock assessment progress, we have had one major milestone. That was a standalone reference point workshop. That was 2 weeks ago. We met the stock assessment subcommittee in Woods Hole and talked through some potential alternatives to the reference points that were defined in the last assessment. And we made some good progress towards reference points there. One of the things we've continued to struggle with that I wanted to bring back to the board is shifting priorities and competing with those shifting priorities, as Caitlin just mentioned, which has led to some folks on the stock assessment subcommittee having little to almost no time to contribute to assessment work. So I just wanted to encourage the board that if you do have a member on the stock assessment subcommittee, to check in with them, make sure that they have adequate time to not only sit in on the calls and attend the workshops that we're having, but also to contribute to actual analyses as part of the assessment and be able to take on tasks as we kind of hit the home stretch of the assessment. the remaining milestones, we do have a assessment workshop, which we are underway planning for the last week of February. That will be our last in-person workshop for the Stock Assessment Subcommittee to wrap up assessment work. We do have a peer review workshop tentatively scheduled for August, and then the results of this assessment and that peer review would be brought back to this board at the annual meeting next year if we remain on track with our proposed assessment timeline. So if there are any questions on the assessment progress, I can take those now. Thank you.
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, thanks for the update, Jeff. Maybe more of a comment than a question. So I know that, Jeff, you're working on one of the models. Connor McManus from my staff's working on one of the others. It's my understanding that, so Larry Jacobson retired, so that was a loss, a big loss to the assessment committee. Burton Shank, who worked on the last assessment, as my understanding, has been kind of pushed off onto a lot of the whale work. So my concern is, Jeff, I don't think you worked on the assessment last time. I know Connor didn't. And so I'm just hoping that there's going to be support for both of you from someone, specifically from Noah Burton. I'm hoping that he will have time, that this gets prioritized for him at some point so that you guys can get some support to kind of check what you've been able to do with the model. I have full confidence in both of you. You're both excellent, but I just, this is a team approach, right? It's what we do, and so it's just kind of critically important that at some point some room is made in the schedule of Burton to kind of check in with you guys and make sure all of the software is running correctly and all of that. Just something I wanted to say on the record I'm concerned about, but I understand, the limited resources as well.
Thank you, Jason. Pat Kelleher.
I appreciate Jason's words. I share his concerns, and I don't want to put Dr. Hare on the spot, but I will put Dr. Hare on the spot since he's in the back of the room. John, can you give us any update on when Burton will be able to spend more time focused on lobster issues?
Thank you very much. At this time, I can't give any further information about when Burton will be able to focus more on lobsters. He and a number of scientists at the Science Center are preparing for a Council for Independent Experts peer review of the decision support tool that Dr. Shank led to advise the take reduction team in terms of the right whale lobster issue. And so once we get further along in that peer review, I can give an update back to ASMFC about his ability to help out in the future.
Any other comments or questions? Do we have any other business that I didn't? Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not on the agenda, but I was curious if Maine could comment on, with the bait shortage for lobster, have they dealt with any exotic baits coming into the state that they've had to shut down, or is that process that they have in place, which is pretty thorough, is that working?
Pat Kelleher.
Dr. Hare probably asked him to put me on the spot since I put him on the spot. No, I appreciate that question. Obviously, with such a drastic reduction in herring, the Maine industry has worked to make that up. We've made it up with approved hard baits that have gone through our system, so several species of Pacific groundfish, to name a few. Carp has been looked at many different levels, especially from the Illinois River. That has been, to date, been rejected, but it looks like we are going to move forward with a very small pilot. We did approve one exotic, and the species name to rosefish, I believe, from Uruguay, if I remember correctly, which went through our bait review committee and was given the green light. We've seen very little of that come in, though, yet. So all in all, I think the system has worked, considering that it is we rely heavily on volunteers, as I've expressed in the past. But with that in mind, I think it's worked. We've said no to a lot of things, and hopefully the process will evolve and we'll continue to make good decisions to stop bad stuff.
Richie's shaking his head. You were satisfied? And was that?
Bill Hyatt.
Bill Hyatt, go ahead.
Just a follow-up to Pat. You said the Asian carp were rejected. I'm just curious as to why. Was it a disease-related rejection or having to do more with the mechanics and the amount of fish coming in?
Bill, both really. VHS is one of the reasons we're trying to continue to look at it. We wanted some environmental testing for the areas that they are going to harvest from during cold weather periods. So they are doing that. The state, along with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, will be doing more of that work this fall and early winter. And then chain of custody became an issue. So we're continuing to look at refining chain of custody as it pertains to the Illinois River. We do allow carp from Kentucky to come in. It is all, there's no disease issues there, so we still maintain a chain of custody to ensure there's no mixing, but that was approved. Actually, carp from Kentucky was approved, I believe, 2 years ago, and we've bring quite a bit of that in.
Anything else? If not, I'll entertain a final motion. Anyone object to adjourning? We're done.
The Tautog board will start at 10:45.